In Britain, we consider ourselves immune from major natural disasters. Thanks to our geography and geology, we have not had to endure the catastrophes that have caused such suffering and loss around the world. But history warns us that we should not be so complacent. In the summer of 1783, Britain endured a disaster that left thousands dead in its wake. It struck in silence and left the victims with no chance to escape. The tragedy turned ordinary men into heroes, while scientists were confounded by the dreadful scenes they witnessed. What was unfolding before their very eyes was one of the worst natural disasters in British history. This calamity was not caused by floods, nor by storms, nor by fires. Britain, in the summer of 1783, was the victim of a huge volcanic eruption. The eruption itself is well known in the scientific community. It is one of the largest in the past 1,000 years. But incredibly, its terrible aftermath has been forgotten by history. Tonight, Time Watch reveals the forgotten story of the British men and women who fell victim to one of the greatest natural disasters in European history. Sunday, June the 8th, 1783. King George III had just lost the War of Independence with the American colonies. In Scotland, James Watt was refining his steam engine, while in France, the Montgolfier brothers were celebrating their first ever flight of a hot air balloon. In Selborne, Hampshire, the clergyman and naturalist Gilbert White was recording an entry into his journal.
Tulips are faded, honeysuckles still in beauty. My columbines are very beautiful, tied some at the stems with pieces of worsted.
Considered to be the founding father of ecology in Britain, he has kept a record on the progress of his garden for the past 15 years. Little did he know that over 1,000 miles away, something terrible was about to happen. Something that would have a dramatic effect on his life and the lives of his fellow countrymen. In Iceland, a peaceful Sunday morning was about to be shattered. At 9 a.m., one of the largest volcanic eruptions in modern history began. Iceland sits on the mid-Atlantic ridge, where two tectonic plates pull away from one another. This makes it particularly prone to volcanic activity. The most recent eruption Iceland experienced was in 1973, on the island of Heimaey, just off the mainland.
A new vent has now appeared on the northwest side of the long-dormant Helgafell volcano, from which lava could flow directly down onto the town below. Great clouds of debris, hot lava and black ash are being hurled high into the air above the town. High winds are carrying hot ash towards deserted homes, some of which are said to be on fire already.
Sigurgeir Jonsson was 30 at the time of the eruption.
I don't think people realized how serious this was at that time. I was not afraid. I found this rather exciting. This was something new that hadn't happened before, and kind of adventure going on.
Beside the harbour, men demonstrate their determination to preserve their community and their livelihoods. The job of saving from these homes anything that can be saved continues.
Sigurgeir had to choose whether to leave his home or stay and help.
I decided to stay. We formed a special rescue team there, several of us guys. But sometimes we had to stop, because when there was raining ashes and glowing stones over us, we just took shelter and waited for it to go over. It was very beautiful at times, but that word beautiful, it was quite prohibited to use it, because in the eyes of most people this was not beautiful, it was horrible. In the darkest days of it, it was very hard to be optimistic. When everything was raining down with black ashes, covering the houses, when the lava was going over, burning them down, well, it was very hard to be optimistic. I just thought I might be dreaming. It was just like a dream to see this. Fire everywhere, where there used to be houses and meadows.
In 1973, they had a good understanding of volcanoes. But 200 years earlier, they did not. Laki was the biggest Icelandic volcano in 1,000 years. As millions of tons of molten lava escaped from the bowels of the earth, the terrified people think hell itself has been unleashed.
It began with the earth heaving upwards, with the great screaming and noise of wind from its depths, then splitting asunder, ripping and tearing as if a crazed animal were tearing something apart.
This eyewitness account comes from the local pastor, Jon Steingrimsson, who lived in the shadow of the eruption. His personal diaries provide a vivid description of this terrifying ordeal for the people of Iceland.
Great slabs of rock were cast up indescribably high into the air, backwards and forwards with great crashes, flares of fire and spouts of sand, smoke and fumes. Oh, how fearsome it was to look upon the tokens and manifestations of God's wrath.
His leadership in the months of crisis that would follow turned him into one of Iceland's greatest heroes. Evidence of that terrifying event is still visible in Iceland today. Professor Thor Thordarson is a world-renowned expert on the Laki eruption.
Right now we're standing on the Laki lava flow at the mouth of the Skafta River Gorge, where it burst out of the Skafta River Gorge in June 1783. The Laki lava flow was produced by an eruption that started on 8th of June in the year 1783 and lasted until February 7th in 1784. This eruption produced an enormous amount of lava, and as an example of that, what we see right here behind us is a gorge which was at least 50 meters deep, might have been as deep as 100 meters right at this spot, is now completely filled up with lava. As the lava was moving down the gorge, flowing at such velocity that right in front of the gorge it looked like a glowing sea of lava. This lava actually poured down out of the gorge here to the south and covered the plains in front of the mountains which you see here in front of us, and in the end it covered 600 square kilometers.
Overall, Laki emitted 15 cubic kilometers of lava, enough to bury London under a layer 30 feet thick.
Right along the foothills of these mountains, we had several farms. There was 2 farms on this side here. One is still right around it behind these hills over here called Skaftártunga. Another one called Au, located right to the southeast here. There were several other farms on this side of the gorge. And when the lava flow came down, it actually went over the land of these farms, destroyed the land to begin with. In the end, it covered the farms.
While the farmers watched helplessly, their livelihoods were destroyed. Jorn Steingrimsson recorded in his journal,
"The flood of fire flowed with the speed of a great river, swollen with meltwater on a spring day. In the middle of the flood of fire, great cliffs and slabs of rock were swept along, tumbling about like large whales swimming, red hot and glowing."
What the pastor was witnessing was no ordinary, explosive, volcanic eruption. It was a potentially far more deadly sort, a fissure eruption.
There's not a single round vent. A fissure eruption, like Laki, is one where the magma comes out of the ground in a series of lines, if you like, a series of segments. The magma is released over usually short segments, a kilometre or 2 or 3 or 4. And one part will erupt for a while, then begin to close down, and as it closes down, the next part opens up. And so it's almost like sort of unzipping the earth and releasing the magma.
Still visible today, the rift left by Laki is a staggering 17 miles long and up to 1,000 foot wide. And Laki showed no signs of abating. Day after day, week after week, great tides of lava coursed down to scorch the villages below.
It's obviously very hot, 1,000 degrees centigrade or something. Remember, we cook meat at about 200 degrees centigrade, so 1,000 degrees centigrade is really hot.
I think it's very difficult for us to imagine how it would have been, how it was like to be here at the time of the eruption. They almost heard sort of a constant boiling behind the mountains here, which is the noise that the volcano itself is making when the magma has been erupted into the atmosphere. It's almost like you can think of it as a big boiling pot of lava there, and it's just constantly boiling and very vigorously.
Thor is able to tell us so much about this horrendous event, thanks to Jorn Steingrimsson's remarkable testimony.
To me, Jorn is probably the first volcanologist in Icelandic history, and he is truly a scientist. He noticed things and details that other people sort of overlooked. A very good example of that is his descriptions of explosions taking place in the lava flow just here west of us. And these explosions were actually producing what we call spattle, big blobs of magma that got thrown up in the air, and they're still molten as they travel through the air, and as they fall on the ground, they splattered, they flattened out. And he described these bombs, they looked like a cow dung. The international sort of word for these bombs today is cow dung bombs.
While Jorn Steingrimsson's observations were objective, he saw no reason to divorce his faith from his reasoning.
Jorn had quite a complex view of what the eruption was. he observed it as act of nature, really, but in a way it was always the higher power, the Almighty, was behind it and had the ultimate control of things. And there was nothing untouched by the Almighty in Jón's view, I think.
And while his scientific interpretations were revolutionary, his worldview was very traditional.
Jón looked at the eruption as a punishment. You know, this is the Lord's way of punishing people who had misbehaved in society, if we can say so. They'd done things that were not moral.
The 215 who died in this area were not felt to be too great a loss, with the exception of 12 to 20, and with the exclusion of children, as no one could say what sort of a person they would have become as adults. The worship of God and public church services were restored to a much more respectable and religious order.
Despite his harsh views on the morality of his parishioners, his bravery and leadership were about to guarantee him a place in the history books.
Jón was not only a keen observer of nature, but also human nature. And as the figurehead of this community here, he also realized that one of his main responsibilities was to keep hope alive.
In July, 6 weeks after the eruptions began, Jón gathered his parishioners for Sunday service.
Skoðum hvað hér hefur skeð fyrir hans.
He asked them to pray to God to spare their lives.
Stóra neyð.
With the lava edging ever closer, those who stayed were putting their future in God's hands. Jón even extended the sermon to further test the faith of his congregation. He told them that only their trust in God would save them. What they discovered when they finally left the church shocked them all. The lava had stopped yards away from where they had been praying. God had intervened to save them from the volcano. Or so it seemed. What they did not know was that the lava was not the greatest threat to their lives. More tragedy was yet to beset them, and Jón Steingrimsson in particular, shaking his faith to its core. And Britain, so far unaware of the eruption, was also about to suffer the disastrous consequences of Laki.
The biggest danger with eruptions like Laki is from the volcanic gases emitted. We're more familiar with explosive eruptions like Mount Pinatubo, which erupted violently in June 1991. Pinatubo was the second largest eruption of the 20th century. At its peak, Laki was producing the same amount of gas as Pinatubo every 3 days. So it was a Pinatubo every 3 days.
In total, Laki would discharge 120 million tons of sulfur dioxide. More than the total emissions of every single factory in Europe over the past 3 years. In the moisture-rich atmosphere above the North Atlantic, the sulfur dioxide was being transformed into sulfuric acid. This lethal cocktail of chemicals began to be buffeted by the winds and spread out far beyond the shores of Iceland. As Gilbert White tended to his garden, he had no idea of what was coming his way.
Corn flags and dark-leaved orange lilies begin to blow. Bees swarm.
The normal situation in summer is that we have a high pressure sitting out in the Atlantic, which would mean that the airflow around Iceland would have been more towards the north, pushing the pollution over the uninhabited polar regions.
But the summer of 1783 was no normal summer. Until recently, it was the hottest on record.
This very hot summer in 1783 was the perfect way to distribute material from Laki across northwestern Europe. In 1783, there was a high pressure that had moved slightly further north and east, and this tends to give us more southerly flow. It also gives us clockwise motion at low levels, which would have been perfect for bringing the pollution from Laki eruption down across northwest Europe.
With the ideal weather conditions in place, the poisonous fog was about to wreak havoc across the villages and towns of Europe. Tuesday, 10th of June, the cloud reached Bergen.
Scorched leaves and ash fall.
16th of June, Prague.
The western sky is hazy and the dry fog comes across the Moldau River.
17th of June, Berlin.
The sun is dull in its shine and coloured like it has been soaked in blood.
18th of June, Paris.
A hot fog obscures the atmosphere.
20th of June, Le Havre.
There followed a permanent fog that reached high into the atmosphere.
On the 22nd of June, the fog arrived in Britain. The following morning, the entire country had been engulfed. Dr. Mark Brachet has scoured hundreds of newspaper archives for reports of the arrival of the deadly fog in Britain.
There's one from the Edinburgh Advertiser for the 12th of July. And if I just read it out, it says, "The thick, dry fog
that has so long prevailed seems to have spread over the whole surface of Europe. Several mariners have also observed it at sea. In the daytime it veils the sun, and towards the evening it has an infectious smell."
It was very distinctive, and it seems to have been pretty pervasive. Certainly in some parts of the coast, not just around Britain, but in other parts of Europe, it was so thick that it was impossible to navigate, and the boats were just kept in port on account of this fog.
So long in a country not subject to fogs, we have been covered with one of the thickest I remember. We see the sun, but shorn of his beams. The trees are scarce discernible at a mile's distance. The sun sets with the face of a red-hot salamander and rises with the same complexion.
This fog was such a phenomenon that it was reported in newspapers right across the country.
Throughout most of the eastern counties there was a most severe frost in the night. It turned most of the barley and oats yellow, to their very great damage.
What you don't really get in the provincial press in the 18th century is any hyperbole, any kind of histrionics. It's all pretty sober, pretty reserved stuff, very English in many ways. But one has to suspect that ordinary folk who perhaps didn't really understand what was going on were really quite frightened, and you get the odd reference to people falling to their knees and praying, and women running about shrieking and so on. So you do get a suggestion that there was real fear and some considerable panic.
Some declare that the sun neither rises nor sets where he did, and assert with great confidence that the day of judgment is at hand.
In 1783, newspapers were aimed solely at the educated elite. One reader would have been Gilbert White.
Gilbert White was a Hampshire clergyman who spent nearly all of his life in one place. And he made it his life's work to observe in minute detail the natural history of Selborne.
Born in 1720 and educated at Oriel College, Oxford, White was ordained in 1749. But his real passion was nature. Everything he witnessed, no matter how small, was documented in his naturalist's journal. Unlike many of his contemporaries, he believed in observing nature in the field as well as collecting specimens.
It amounts to a really very detailed, systematic, continuous record of what was going on in Selborne day by day, week by week, month by month for 25 years. So it's a really important source for natural historians and ecologists. But for my work, what was so important is that we've got from a scientist a record of what was going on in June, July, August and September of 1783.
Towards the end of his life, Gilbert White compiled his journal notes into what would become a classic bestseller, The Natural History of Selborne. In it, he described his own experiences of the mysterious haze.
He writes that the summer of the year 1783 was an amazing and portentous one, and full of horrible phenomena, wonderful phrases.
The peculiar haze or smoky fog that prevailed for many weeks in this island and in every part of Europe and beyond its limits was a most extraordinary appearance, unlike anything known within the memory of man. The sun at noon looked as blank as a clouded moon and shed a rust-coloured ferruginous light on the ground and the floors of rooms, but was particularly lurid and blood-coloured at rising and setting.
It's wonderful language, but it really sums up in just a paragraph what they were experiencing in England in June and July of 1783.
Gilbert White would not have confined his thoughts to his journal. Like Jorn Steingrimsson, he had a duty of care to a worried congregation whose fears needed to be allayed. But Gilbert White's interpretation of events was very different to Jorn Steingrimsson's.
But he's one of that group of clergymen who are rationalists. They're Enlightenment scholars. So they're not indulging in this notion that there's some wrathful God who's exacting some kind of revenge on society for their ill doings. He is a person who's looking for an explanation of what's going on. And I'm quite sure that he was talking to his parishioners, telling them not to worry, these things are all part of the natural pattern, and it isn't about a vengeful God.
But as the summer progressed, the parishioners of Selborne had good reason to worry. The long-term exposure to the poisonous fog began to take its toll. We now know that sulfur dioxide, even at low levels, can be deadly. On contact with the moisture in human lungs, it turns to sulfuric acid and corrodes their soft, sensitive tissue, choking the victim from within. In 1783, entire villages were forced to watch helplessly as vulnerable friends and neighbors died agonizing deaths. Until recently, very little was known about the effects of the Larky haze. Dr. John Grattan has spent the last 15 years researching this episode across Europe. He has followed the trail of evidence to Chartres in France. What he has uncovered are some of the starkest, most frightening descriptions of the impact the haze had on human health.
After 18 days, there were 40 dead. One pretends that the fog that turned the sun as red as blood forecast this curse. May God preserve my parish.
We're in Chartres because this is the centre of an area that was particularly badly affected by the sulphur from Lacky in 1783. We have villages Impot, Bruay and Landel, which we know from the records were particularly badly affected. The priests in all those parishes describe the presence of the sun smoke, the sulphurous fog, and how the people of their parishes were being literally killed. They were quite clearly associating the fog, the sulphurous fog, with the deaths.
While the sun was obscured, there was a sickness which caused innumerable deaths.
The curé of Impo describes how a third of the men of his parish were swept to their tombs while the fog was here. And one can only imagine what that was like. It's a very powerful way of describing this event. A third of the men of his parish swept to their tombs. And this is a sort of common theme that runs through this region.
Amongst the accounts of the death and suffering, Dr. Grattan discovered evidence of how the haze struck terror into those that saw it.
For instance, in Bruay, the parish priest describes how the people were so afraid of the fog and the devils within it that they got the priest they dragged the priest literally from his house, made him put on his vestments, his holy orders, and perform a service of exorcism on the cloud. And you can only imagine how terrified people must have been at the time. You know, the sun was obscured, and there was a stench of sulphur in the air, and obviously they thought that the gates of hell have opened and the devil's walking the earth, and they think the end of the world is coming.
These apocalyptic scenes caused pandemonium across France and prompted numerous articles in the French newspapers.
The French astronomer de Lalande obviously observed the fog, and quite clearly he observed the panic that it was causing amongst the populace of France. And he went to the lengths of writing a paper about it and having this published. And the purpose of this appears to have been to calm the fears of the populace, because he writes in this account that he's seen many fogs like this in the records, and it's nothing to worry about. It's just the air leaving the ground after a damp spring. But of course, I don't think the people took that at all seriously, because they could smell the sulphur and they knew that nothing like that had happened before.
Overall, the death rate in this region of France increased by about 5%. But precise numbers for the rest of France are difficult to establish, because French burial and death records have not been compiled as they have been in Britain. The next stage in Dr. Grattan's work was to discover if Larky had an equally tragic impact on the health of British men and women.
In my research, I'd been to archives all over Britain. Joseph William, labourer, buried September the 27th. Samuel Flinders, labourer, buried September the 10th. Thomas Butcher, farmer, buried September the 3rd. Labourers are collapsing in the fields and dying, and that's what we might expect to see in modern air pollution instance if people are having to do heavy manual labour. It's simply physiologically very difficult for the body to cope with the poor air and the high temperatures and the physical work. And you can see in the parish records we've been looking at that labourers are there, people in the prime of their life, and they're dying in the summer.
But the names of individuals weren't enough. John was looking for a pattern of excessive deaths, a mortality crisis.
I was really determined to nail down the hard numbers. But I was fortunate enough to uncover the Population History of England database, and remarkably I was able to order this data on a CD, and it only cost me £12, the best £12 I've ever spent in my life. So this CD arrived in the mail, and I popped it into my laptop computer thinking, well, I bet there's nothing here, and created a graph, and my jaw dropped and my hair stood on end, because there in front of me was quite clearly something very, very strange happening in the summer of 1783.
In his pursuit of further clues, John Grattan focused his search on the well-preserved death records of Bedfordshire.
Typically, in a parish like this one, Malden, the normal number of people who might be expected to have died in the summer would be about 4 or 5. And in the summer of 1783, there are 17 people die here. And in Cranfield, 23 people die in the summer, and usually they'd see about 6. And in Ampshill, it's 11, and usually it's about 5. So you see, parish by parish, these numbers add up considerably.
The evidence John has uncovered is corroborated by an eyewitness, William Cooper, the well-known poet. He saw firsthand the consequences of Larky's lethal haze on the British population.
Such multitudes are indisposed by fevers in this country that farmers have difficulty gathering their harvest. The labourers, having been almost every day been carried out of the field, incapable of work, and many die.
In total, the death rate for the entire county of Bedfordshire doubled in the autumn of 1783.
Well, the figures would tempt us to think that Bedfordshire's exceptional, but we can go south from Lincolnshire, Grimsby on Hull, down into Leicestershire, into Norfolk, Suffolk, Essex, Middlesex, down into Surrey and Kent, and we find these episodes of mortality everywhere.
From these 5s and 10s, the numbers begin to escalate into the hundreds, then thousands, then tens of thousands. In total, John estimates that Larky's deadly fog killed 23,000 British people in the summer of 1783, the equivalent of 100,000 people today. Even more remarkably, these deaths occurred in August and September, a season of plenty and historically the time when mortality is at its lowest. Larky's toxic cloud lingered over Britain throughout July and August. But that summer, the deadly haze was not the only ordeal to be endured by the people of Europe. For at that time, the whole continent was being racked by the most incredible storms.
The newspapers, before 1783, you don't find weather reports. But suddenly for this year, the weather is so peculiar. The newspapers are full of weather reports. From September, late September, October, they diminish again. It really underlines how extraordinary this episode was.
There seems lately to have been an almost universal perturbation in nature. All Europe has been shaken by some uncommon convulsions.
The storms which started to occur during the summer of 1783 seem to have been really exceptionally severe. Torrential rain, flash floods, hailstones, huge hailstones that were big enough to kill livestock, lightning on a scale that people had not seen before.
On Tuesday last, there was a most tremendous storm of lightning, thunder, rain and hail. A team of 4 horses were upon the road during the thunderstorm. In a flash of lightning, 2 4-horses were killed in an instant.
There are a lot of reports that seem to link the haze with the thunderstorms. They felt that the hot haze had caused the atmosphere to build up and be overcharged, and then you got the lightning and then you got the thunderstorms. There's certainly evidence of that in the newspapers.
By the autumn of 1783, the toxic cloud that had caused such tragic loss of life finally dissipated, and the population of Britain could breathe again. But the death and destruction caused by Larky was far from over. As autumn turned to winter, it started to get very, very cold.
Larky emitted a huge amount of sulfur dioxide into the troposphere, the lowest parts of the atmosphere, and some up at higher levels into the stratosphere. Once that material gets into the stratosphere, it undergoes chemical reactions to form tiny droplets of sulfuric acid, which then scatter the sunlight back towards space rather than allowing it to reach the surface, and therefore you would tend to see a cooling of the Earth's surface for the next few years.
The winter of 1783 wasn't only exceptionally cold, it was also exceptionally long. Naturally, the unrelenting winter was recorded in minute detail by Gilbert White.
February 13th. This evening the frost has lasted 28 days. April 4th, snow as deep as the horse's belly under the hedges in the north field. April 22nd, the spring is backward to an unusual degree.
The Laki winter was one of the most severe in 250 years. In Britain alone, the horrific conditions took the lives of 8,000 people more than the average winter. When spring arrived, terrible floods of meltwater struck across Europe. In Frankfurt, Germany, the family home of the German author Goethe was flooded. Goethe's mother wrote,
"We have had terrible floods here. As I write this, my cellar is still full of water, and ships are passing through our streets. In particularly low areas, the water has risen to the first floor."
When the floodwaters finally receded, Europe could start to rebuild and recover. But 1,000 miles away, alone in the North Atlantic, Iceland's experience was about to go from bad to worse. By the time Laki finally stopped erupting in February 1784, it had emitted 8 million tons of fluorine, a highly toxic chemical. The fluorine had mixed with ash and fallen to earth, where it was eaten by cattle and other livestock. The ingested fluorine killed 80% of Iceland's sheep and more than half of all cows and horses. Having survived the volcano, the people of Iceland now began to starve.
Inevitably, the people's diet changed. They boiled skin from animals just to get some nutrition out. And even it got to the point that they were taking the books that they had, which were actually handwritten on skin, and they were boiling the pages and tried to get some nutrition out of those things.
Jorn wrote,
"Those people who did not have enough older and undiseased supplies of food to last them through these times of pestilence also suffered great pain. Their bodies became bloated. The insides of their mouths and their gums swelled and cracked, causing excruciating pain and toothache. 6, sometimes 8, sometimes 10 were buried in a single grave."
And God's judgment tragically struck closer to home than Jorn expected. Thuna Hannesdottir, Jorn's wife of 38 years, was a victim of the famine, casting the pastor into a deep depression.
I experienced an overpowering malaise and insomnia, which aroused harmful thoughts in me and every kind of temptation. The period from the autumn of 1784 until the spring of 1785 was the most dismal that I ever lived through. When I lost my wonderful wife, everything collapsed around me.
Jorn's wife was one of 10,000 people to die in Iceland as a consequence of the Laki eruption. 1/4 of the country's population. The Laki eruption was a pivotal moment in Icelandic history, which still looms large in the national consciousness. School children today are still taught of Jorn Steingrimsson, his fire sermon, and how he managed to keep hope alive and see them through their darkest hour. But until recently, little has been known of how, for months on end, Laki's deadly haze choked the people of Britain and Europe. Towering summer storms destroyed crops and livestock, making front-page news around the country. And a long and bitter winter claimed even more lives. And yet, the deadly aftermath of the Laki eruption has been lost in the mists of time. Unlike in Iceland, our land bears no scar to remind us of this tragic event. Once the haze had lifted, there was no physical evidence of Laki's cloud ever having visited our shores. The names of those who died have long been forgotten. The newspapers, concerned as they were with the foibles and interests of the well-to-do, made no mention of the labourers who died in their fields. No one knew at the time that Laki, a volcano thousands of miles away, was to blame for their deaths. The chilling fact remains that we are no safer today than we were 230 years ago.
We might think, being in insular Britain, that we're safe from the effects of volcanic eruptions, but in fact, eruptions like Laki will become famous in the future the next time we get another one, because they're going to be huge events and they're going to affect many, many millions of people.
While society has changed, nature has not.
What has been accomplished in sort of the Western society over the past 100 years or so is to give immunization against most of what nature can throw at us. So in terms of relatively small hazard events or fairly short-term droughts or periods of excess rainfall and so on, that society can handle that. What society can't handle are the very extreme events, like we saw with the Indian Ocean tsunami in 2004 with Hurricane Katrina. Compared with other perils to which Britain's exposed, like flooding or windstorms, because there are no major hurricanes in Britain, and the earthquake risk is very low in Britain, that certainly this indirect risk from volcanic activity in Iceland would pose the biggest individual threat from a natural disaster.
And we really don't know when the next one will occur, but there will be another one. If the winds are in the wrong, quote-unquote, direction, ash clouds, gas clouds, sulfuric acid clouds from Iceland could sweep across Britain again. And that's when the world will turn around and say, well, why didn't you tell us about these eruptions before?
If you share our passion for the past and want to delve deeper into the stories unearthed by Time Watch, why not subscribe to our regular email newsletter for programme updates, further information and access to exclusive events? It costs nothing. Visit bbc.co.uk/timewatch to subscribe.